Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me. Appreciate you all being here. I am a wildlife biologist, as Buck mentioned. I grew up hiking in the Cascades and have been living and working in Hood River since 2006. I have a PhD in conservation genetics from the University of California at Davis and have been studying carnivores such as grizzly bears in Yellowstone and jaguars in Belize for most of my career. In 2008, as was mentioned, I started the Cascades Carnivore Project as a really small effort to investigate the presence of a wolverine on Mount Adams and determine whether wolverines were reestablishing outside of their known distribution. Our work has expanded greatly to cover rare species that occupy the Cascade Range throughout Washington, and we are now a conservation science non-governmental organization based here in Hood River. We're working with government agencies, other non-governmental organizations, and citizens to understand the conservation issues facing rare carnivores and their habitats. It really was a great experience working with Columbia Insight. Chuck Thompson did a wonderful job of teasing out the story after I had laid out the broad strokes. As a scientist and not a professional storyteller, I have really been trained to write very technically without flourish or opinion. And so it was really helpful to have an editor to help guide the narrative. And it was rewarding to bring out a story that resonated with the community. I'm interested in studying wolverines because they are intrepid animals that live in really wild, beautiful places that I love to visit. Spending time in wild places with wild animals energizes and inspires me, as probably does for you too. I actually develop many of my research ideas while I'm out hiking alone in the subalpine during any month of the year. And I'm fascinated by carnivores, wolverines, and really most carnivores are incredible individuals with unique personalities. I'm fascinated that within a single species, you can have all sorts of individuals making a living in totally unique and different ways. So some background on wolverines. They were extirpated from Washington in the 1930s due to overharvest and to a larger degree, predator-controlled programs targeting other carnivores. And by the 1990s, carnivore biologists began to notice that wolverines were making a natural comeback. The original population that was once in the Cascades was gone, but it had been replaced by wolverines moving south out of British Columbia and Alberta. And in 2005, the Yakama Nation documented a wolverine on Mount Adams, which was way outside of their known distribution in the North Cascades. Cascades Carnivore Project was started to monitor wolverines at their southern range periphery in Washington. This was one of the first photos we got of the Mount Adams individual. You can see 2009. And exactly a decade after we began in 2008, we documented the first reproduction of wolverines in Washington in the South Cascades in over a century when we discovered this wolverine family. So things are improving from that one wolverine on Mount Adams. And a couple things have happened since I wrote the Columbia Insight article. First, we learned that the new female wolverine that I mentioned at the end of the article, who we documented on Mount Rainier, was indeed lactating, so making her the second documented reproductive wolverine female south of I-90 in Washington. Interstate 90 cuts east-west across Washington, as many of you know, and is a significant road barrier for wolverines and many wildlife species right through the middle of the Cascades. It creates a challenge for linking wolverine populations in the North and South Washington Cascades. In June, the new female at Mount Rainier visited a second one of our monitoring stations, this time bringing her 2 young kits, as you can see here in the photo. They have been photographed as recently as September, so we know that they have made it through the early months where mortality is highest, which is hopeful for their long-term survival in the South Cascades. And a second thing that happened is a few weeks ago on October 8th, the US Fish and Wildlife Service declined to list the wolverine as endangered or threatened under the Endangered Species Act. There's no empirical estimate of the number of wolverines in the lower 48, but it is thought to be as little as 300 individuals. The listing decision employed a shorter term definition of what's called foreseeable future than had previously been used when they decided that climate change will not affect wolverines. Wolverines are considered a snow obligate species because they use the snowpack to den and also to refrigerate their food, and therefore they're particularly sensitive to climate warming. So it left a lot of scientists confused with the decision. There is another species that I'd like to talk about today that is also likely to be affected by climate change and is also close to my heart. The Cascade red fox is one of the rarest species in Washington, which is the only place where they are found. I became interested in studying this fox when I first began those wolverine surveys on Mount Adams. At the time, the only Cascade red fox field study that had been conducted was around Mount Rainier in the 1980s by a scientist named Keith Aubrey. No research had been conducted in the 25-year period since his work. And in 2008, when I began surveys on Mount Adams, almost nothing was known about Cascade red fox ecology or even where they occurred apart from on Mount Rainier. In the beginning, I had no luck documenting a wolverine on Mount Adams. However, I soon began getting photos of these rare foxes at our camera stations high on the volcano. And through a mentorship with Keith Aubrey, that earlier Cascade red fox researcher, I slowly came to understand how interesting and unique these carnivores are. Wildlife managers have only recently begun to appreciate their distinctness within the fauna of the Cascades, and I'd like to share their story with you. This is not, however, a simple story. The red fox has had a bum rap for as long as civilizations have been telling stories. Due to its omnivorous diet and innate curiosity, this small carnivore is the trickster of folklore and is persecuted as a pesky chicken killer from children's books to real life encounters with humans. The red fox is often considered a sly and devious predator. And it's one of the most ubiquitous carnivores on Earth with almost 50 subspecies worldwide. It is considered a species of least concern by the World Conservation Union, meaning it is abundant and globally widespread. However, there are 3 subspecies of red fox that live high on the mountains of the American West: the Cascade, Sierra Nevada, and Rocky Mountain red foxes. Together, these are the mountain foxes, and they are distinct morphologically, genetically, and ecologically from all other red foxes. These foxes also have a unique evolutionary history in North America that was first elucidated by Keith Aubrey in the 1980s, that was later supported through DNA analyses. So the colonization of the red fox into North America was shaped by 2 waves of migration across the Bering Land Bridge from present-day Russia into North America. 500,000 years ago, during the second to last ice age, the red fox first colonized North America over that Bering Land Bridge, which was connected due to a lower sea level created by the formation of continental ice sheets. And when the glaciers melted and the Bering Strait reestablished, red foxes became isolated on separate continents. The foxes in North America swept south across the boreal forests of Canada and into the northern United States. Then, During the most recent glaciation, the Bering Land Bridge reformed and a second wave of red foxes migrated into North America. And during this period, the ancestors of the mountain foxes were pushed south of the ice sheets where the land was ice-free. And on these wind-swept, sparsely treed plains of the western and central United States, they adapted to a cold glacial climate, which lasted 100,000 years. And when those ice sheets receded back towards the poles, the foxes in the west migrated up into the mountains. There they became isolated and diverged from that second wave of red foxes now making its way across the boreal forest in North America. And the mountain foxes are now isolated high in the Cascade, Sierra Nevada, and Rocky Mountain ranges. That second wave of foxes are the ancestors of lowland red foxes, which occur naturally throughout Alaska and Canada in the eastern United States. Beginning in the late 1800s, they were brought west for fur farming and hound hunting. And over time, these lowland red foxes escaped or were released from captivity, and their descendants are now living as a non-native red fox in many parts of the West. So historically, Cascade red foxes occurred throughout Washington's Cascades and southern British Columbia's coastal mountains, but now they're only found in Washington and are rarely detected in the North Cascades ecosystem. They live year-round on the upper slopes of the Cascade volcanoes and other high elevation sites, such as the Goat Rocks Wilderness. They do not leave their snowy abode during the harshest blizzards of winter, nor interbreed with red foxes in the valleys. They're finely tuned for a life at altitude. They have fur-lined feet, as you can see in this photo we captured at one of our camera stations, and they have a small body mass. It's thought that they may occur at high elevations to avoid coyotes, which are a major predator of lowland red foxes. Coyotes do not move as efficiently through the deep snow. So Cascade red foxes live in remote mountainous terrain that's hard to get to, and generally they avoid people. At Mount Rainier National Park, visitors have regularly observed them for over a century, but elsewhere they're really elusive and hard to find. Despite numerous surveys of other carnivores' efforts that could detect a fox, they had rarely been reported in the Cascades when I began my research. However, with our efforts focused on the fox, we detected them throughout the South Cascades. So you can see the blue dots are camera stations where we photographed them. I-90 is highlighted there in orange. You can see how it bisects what was their historical distribution, the light purple. In the North Cascades, only 7 single Cascade red fox observations have been documented over the past 40 years. So those are the pink dots plus the green dot is a genetic sample that we were able to obtain a few years ago. So as fox researchers, myself and others are now pretty concerned that the Cascade red fox is experiencing a dramatic range contraction and wonder if they've become isolated into really small populations in parts of their range. After deploying over 250 camera stations in the South Cascades of Washington and collecting 1,000 DNA samples for analyses, I discovered that they occur as a single small but widespread and breeding population. So meaning the population is well connected and not isolated into small populations in the South. But I also found that they occur over much larger areas than expected and their genetic diversity is low. Cascades Carnivore Project has a new study examining the threat of climate change to Cascade red foxes by employing this cool new genetic technique called DNA metabarcoding to sequence DNA from each prey species within a fox's scat. We can then identify their most important prey items and model how these prey populations are predicted to change with climate change. This will provide a picture of the fox's vulnerability to changes in their habitat. We were fortunate to get some great footage of breeding foxes at the camera stations. Here's a pair checking each other out at the end of February, not really jiving. Then they're getting intimate on March 1st and mating the following day. So this is the first evidence showing when mountain foxes mate, and it highlights how little we know about their basic biology. These photos are helping to better understand the details of mountain fox reproduction. We're also working with wildlife photographers to monitor dens and learn more about their reproductive ecology. These two yearlings were associated with a den at Crystal Mountain Resort that was located in 2016. Interestingly, there was 5 individuals photographed in the area. So the female, her mate, her kit of the year, and then these 2 young individuals that we think are yearlings or 2-year-old siblings. They all had black coats, which occur at a rate of about 10% in lowland populations, but up in the mountains, they're a lot more common. We received some great photographs of young foxes. This is helping to give a picture of reproductive timing, how many kits are born each year, and how many survive in the first months of life. This is critical data and an important opportunity to engage the greater conservation community to help us. So to put the Cascade red fox conservation picture together, in southern Washington, they're represented as a single disparate population that's well connected with individuals dispersing over large area. For example, individuals will leave Mount Rainier and come to Mount Adams as they leave their natal zone. And while their abundance is unknown, it appears low. We only detected 51 individuals over a 5,000 square kilometer area. They're inhabiting much larger areas than we expected. Now we're surveying for foxes north of I-90 in the North Cascades. Our objectives are to see if they are still present in the North Cascades ecosystem, and then use DNA samples to assess their genetic diversity and see if there's connectivity with the southern population. So where do we go from here? We have a wolverine population showing up again in the South Cascades after a long absence of perhaps 50 years or more. How many are there? We will continue to monitor individuals as part of a collective effort I'm leading to reconstruct the recolonization of wolverines in Washington through DNA analyses. We have a Cascade red fox population that lives nowhere else in the world except here in these mountains, and they may be threatened with extinction, but we know so little about their basic ecology and distribution. We do not yet know how climate change in the mountains, which we're currently witnessing, will affect the Cascade red fox or the wolverine. How can we make sure that they don't disappear? These are the challenges that we face. We have these amazing carnivores right in our backyard, and our goal is to figure out what they require to survive and thrive so that they always have a home here. Consider joining our citizen science program. We're sorting through photos this winter, and we'll be out next summer in the South Cascades. And finally, I'd just like to thank all of our generous funders and collaborators.